Today on Press Review, I'm joined by my reaction colleagues Tim Montgomerie and Maggie Pagano. Press Review is the show where the reaction editors discuss the stories and writing and podcasts and films that have caught our eye in the last 7 days or so, that illuminate bigger truths about what's going on in the world. So the first choice falls to me. My first pick is Henry Olsen in the Washington Post, where he's essentially saying, and this is, we'll get to the UK reshuffle and British politics, I'm sure, at some point, but I think what's happened with this new defence deal between the US, Australia and the UK, AUKUS as it's being called, is a tectonic plates shifting moment in geopolitics. So much to talk about. But what fascinated me about it is, and I'm very interested in how how Americans are viewing the rest of us, is that Henry's piece essentially says this is a masterstroke by the US, that it reorganizes the West, outfoxes China, and should cheer everyone up who believes in Western values and the unity of the West. Now, I must confess, I have mixed feelings about this move. I think while it's tempting to see the way in which it's infuriated, Maggie, the French particularly. I mean, the French have cancelled various celebratory events that they had scheduled for this weekend with the US to celebrate the great US-French alliance. This decision, essentially meaning that Australia will have American nuclear-powered subs rather than buying from France, has infuriated France. And I think while there's a short-term, maybe even amusement factor in some of that, and particularly in Britain, where the Brexit debate obviously colours everything, I think it's longer term, medium term and longer term, potentially quite worrying that it divides the West. Do you see it as, well, firstly, do you think, Maggie, that am I overstating how important this deal is, its significance, and do you think the French are right to be annoyed?
I don't think you're overstating it. Even the Chinese have named it the new Cold War. I mean, this was clearly a very direct, came from the Australians, apparently, Australians and Americans, and then to Britain, asked Britain specifically, Western surveillance in the Asia Pacific with submarines going up round the China seas. I mean, it is quite an aggressive act in many ways. So no, it's a huge shift. And I think it has huge ramifications for NATO. As you just said, France is the second or third biggest spender in NATO, very close ally of Britain. So not only does it drive a wedge between the US and France, but Britain and France, who always work traditionally very closely together. From what one hears, the French-US deal for the diesel-powered submarines was dead in the water anyway. That was, that's sort of an old story. But the way they presented it, and I don't know if you guys watched the video that night, it was sort of, well, I wrote in a column this morning, it was sort of like a Bond movie where, you had the three head leaders, beamed in live. It's very funny, actually, Biden couldn't remember Morrison's name. You sort of expected Dr. Evil or Dr. No to come in and be beamed down and say, hey, guys, what are you doing? You're starting a new war. It was really weird. So I think presentation wasn't very clever.
And you watch too many films, Maggie.
I do, clearly. But I think rather foolish and unnecessary to have alienated France like this. We do need France. I mean, what does it tell us about US relations with NATO? I don't know. But we had only this week Ursula von der Leyen talking about a new defence force for the EU. So you can sort of see, as you said, tectonic plates moving here.
What I thought was interesting, though, about Henry's piece in the Washington Post was that it makes a series of assumptions about American power and presents it as a masterstroke, whereas actually I think it's possible to. The West does need to reorganize and regenerate because of the threat from China, and there's been a lot of conversation in the last couple of years. How do you what's the forum in which you do that? It really doesn't seem that it can be NATO, and it can't, despite what Macron wants, it can't be the EU, because the Brits are not going to sign up to be essentially under EU command. Though interestingly, Bruno Waterfield in the Times on Friday reports that the Dutch are making overtures, essentially trying to get Britain to take part in a conversation about European security and increased defence cooperation. So there's a problem, but there's a problem there. The Brits have very close military working relationships with the French, but are not going to embed themselves. Boris Johnson is not going to embed himself in a European defence superstructure, which is overseen effectively by the European Commission. I mean, Brexit means that is not going to happen. So there's all of this swirling around, plus the idea that Boris Johnson had, and the influence of his foreign affairs advisor John Bew, Attlee's biographer, the notion of a bigger Western alliance, something like a D10. Which is going to be Five Eyes plus the intelligence partnership plus France, Japan, certainly an increasingly critical power when it comes to organising against China defensively, and with a question mark against India. But that now, in the context of this deal, which costs France tens of billions of euros to its defence industry and is regarded by the French as publicly humiliating. I mean, Henry says it's a masterstroke, but it doesn't look to me like it's not a Kissingerian brilliant piece of diplomacy when one of your main allies accuses you publicly, the French, accuses the Biden administration of stab in the back. The other story that I wanted to mention in that context, just to remind us all that Afghanistan has not gone away as a subject, is a really interesting story from a magazine called Newsline. Newsline's magazine covers the Middle East in a very interesting way with long-form essays. And there's a piece just published this week called "The Drone Unit That Helped the Taliban Win the War." And we put on Press Review the links to these pieces, which have grabbed us below the video, so you can read for yourself. But it's a really interesting report by one of their journalists, an Afghan journalist, and it details how the Taliban got their hands on some really sophisticated, interesting drones and used them in their campaign to take over the whole of Afghanistan, which has been portrayed in a lot of the Western media as well, just these sort of hicks rolling in from the countryside and rolling into the urban areas, and the army ran away. But it tells a really interesting story about where they got the kit from, allegedly from inside China on the black market, and then how they used that to take out various anti-Taliban warlord commanders on the ground. So I heartily recommend that. Shall we move on to the reshuffle?
Can I just cut? I've been focusing on the much more important who's up and who's down inside the Tory party rather than the geostrategic stuff you've been looking at, Iain. But on the face of it, I think I share the concerns of you both. After the Afghanistan debacle, I think one of the key things that struck me was how dependent we are on America. And it seemed to me a good moment to pause and think, post-Brexit, does Britain need other options? You know, a lot of our technology, our military hardware, etc., is almost completely dependent upon operations with America. France, you know, has more independence of operation. And it did seem, and I'm a committed Brexiteer, haven't changed on that, but we should have options in the world. And, you know, being close to France bilaterally, Europe's other military power, seemed a wise path for us to at least explore and to, you know, not even discuss with Paris what we were doing. It's just strikes me as amateurish. And so I love Henry. I regard him as a good friend, but masterstroke is not the word I would use to describe this. I worry that the West is very badly led at the moment. And this looks like more of a rush job to look like the West is on the ball post-Afghanistan, and I fear the reverse is true.
So I'm going to write in my reaction newsletter for reaction members this weekend, going out on Saturday morning. I'm going to write a bit more about this and about some of the background about how it's happened, how it came together, and some of the implications. I think I agree with you, Tim, on the French situation, where actually it's a process that began under Sarkozy and has continued under his successors. That incredible closeness on defence between Britain and France, where essentially in some respects we operate interwoven. In operationally in every single aspect. You just look at the launch of the carriers and the operation that was assembled around that. That was done very much with France's help. Now, the problem in all of this, though, is President Macron. Whereas to just present it from, you look at it from the perspective for a second of London. For many months now, the Brits have been attempting to organise a proper summit involving Boris and Macron to discuss all manner of things, to which the French response has been essentially, no, there's nothing to discuss. They have just seen it as the Brits wanting special pleading on Brexit and Northern Ireland, whereas the Brits have been trying to say, no, the world is changing, there's all this other stuff at stake. Shouldn't the Brits and the French at least meet properly and kind of see what comes out of it? And France has said no, partly because of Macron's view that Britain has made a historic mistake and that the solution to European security lies via the EU rather than purely bilateral stuff or stuff that involves the Americans. So Britain, London has and Boris have tried, and essentially they haven't been welcomed with open arms. So I think we're just going to move on now to, I mentioned there, Boris Johnson, who's had a hell of a week. It's been reshuffle week in the UK. And Tim, tell us a bit about that. Your pick on this is from The Guardian, I think.
Yeah, I think generally in this press review, I think the idea is that we pick articles and features that people might enjoy and learn from. This, viewers, is not such an example. I think when I look back at my distinguished journalistic career, and there are so many great articles to choose from, of course, I think one of my favourite ones, Iain, you might remember it, I wrote a review for the Times of one of Polly Toynbee's books.
Yes, I do remember that, yes.
But John Witherow, the editor, loved it. Basically, I read this book. It was on the Cameron years. 300-400 pages. There was not one nice thing in that article about David Cameron or the Conservatives. In 400 or whatever pages, Polly Toynbee could not find even one thing to say positive about her political opponents. And Polly Toynbee is part of the problem in British politics. She probably one week will write about hyper-partisanship and Fox News and talk radio and complain about extremism. And then she will find nothing good to acknowledge in the Conservatives. This latest piece is classic Toynbee. Every Tory minister is attacked. They're all idiots or nasty or, we know what she writes. It's just not helpful to journalism. And my particular bee in my bonnet at the moment, and full declaration, Nadine Dorries is a very, very good friend of mine, is, the way particularly women journalists are covering her appointment as culture secretary. It just, seems to be the case that, these identity politics campaigners, they want more women, but whenever a Tory woman is appointed, they don't quite work. What they don't want more women actually in politics, they want more people like them. And I feel a longer article coming on, though we don't have time in this press review, but it's just the lazy stereotypes. Nadine Dorries, Polly Toynbee, is not the same as Priti Patel. They may be Tory women, but they think differently. You know, Nadine Dorries has a very pro-lockdown point of view. You know, she takes quite unorthodox views on various issues. I don't know, have an Andrea Leadsom moment, but she's more of a mother in many ways than a woman, or at least both. Family, community really matter to her. She has a better understanding of her colleagues than 90% of her male counterparts. She laughs at them. They all want to be prime minister. I'll probably be told off by her for mentioning this, but when Dominic Cummings was downstairs working in Downing Street when Boris was upstairs, very ill with COVID, I think Dominic was quite happy with the situation because he was in charge. He didn't even have to get the rubber stamp. It was Nadine who rang the medical people and said, I think the Prime Minister is incredibly ill. She's not conventionally intellectual, but she's run a business. She writes best-selling books. She's incredibly close to the Prime Minister. We actually have a culture secretary who's probably going to be the most influential culture secretary because of her closeness to the Prime Minister for ages. But we just get lazy, terrible journalism. And I'm going to stop there because otherwise I will rant and rant and rant. But
no,
Polly Toynbee really is the worst of political journalism, I'm afraid.
So, Maggie, well, firstly, do you have a reflection on that? But also, you've also picked a story on the reshuffle. But the point that Tim there made about how Tory women are covered.
Yes, I mean, there's such snootiness, isn't there? Such snobbiness. And it was also quite remarkable how, Wes Streeting made the point about Nadeem Zahawi. How on earth could he be education secretary when he'd been to a private school, forgetting that this was somebody who came here from, war-torn Iraq and clearly, has had the life of a great immigrant family. I just can't bear it. Everything is reduced. It's like the whole debate about Emma Raducanu, she's from Bromley, can we just get over all this stuff? Anyway.
Went to a grammar school.
And went to a grammar school, selective grammar school. I know, terrible. Anyway, let's move on. So I've chosen Fraser Nelson's column in the Daily Telegraph today, where he once again asks about the future of Michael Gove, one of the most influential reformers in cabinet. And he says, is his move to housing the end of Gove or the moment he redefines Toryism forever? We know headline writers exaggerate a bit, but he does ask the question, was this a sort of sadistic demotion or actually, and I think we reflected on this earlier in the week, a sign that he really wants Gove's intellectual reforming skills to get to grips with housing and also levelling up whatever it is, and can he define it? He doesn't tell us which way he thinks Gove will go, but he says that if he can get to grips with this, and really, it's not just about saying 300,000 houses a year, but talk to the house builders, look at how the housing market really operates, crack some of those monopolies we have, because we know that 60% of the market is controlled by 3 house builders. Some really fundamental reforms are needed. Then maybe he can help put a few bombs under planning.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting piece.
Yeah, it's a really, really good piece. It's just going to be interesting to see, as we discussed earlier in the week on Reaction, how much leeway Gove has and how radical or robust he's allowed to be, because it seems as though planning reform is shut down. He doesn't have any control unless he can arrange something with the Chancellor and with the Bank of England. The cheap money policy is going to continue, which is distorting the housing market and distorting demand. And is he going to be allowed to construct something like a sort of English housing corporation underpinned by the state? I have an open mind on it. I'm going to be really interested to see what he comes up with, because it's Just look at what's happening to.
Well, the obvious thing, Iain, is maybe launch a Competition and Markets Authority investigation into the house builders. You know, maybe.
Yes. I mean, that's something that Liam Halligan,
yeah.
the Telegraph and GB News has been suggesting very much ahead of the curve. So let's see what happens.
Can I suggest scrap Help to Buy first of all? Stop inflating demand and focus on supply.
All the gimmicks, and slash stamp duty. I mean, you read the piece by, stamp duty is actually holding up the whole process of people downsizing. Why would you? We read Doug McBrillian's fantastic piece for us earlier this week. It was one of the main points. Anyway, we must do a session on housing one day.
Yeah, we're just and if you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, you're watching Press Review with me, Iain Martin, Maggie Pagano, and Tim Montgomerie. It's the weekly show where we analyse the stories that have really grabbed us, that illuminate the big trends in media and politics and geopolitics and culture. So and just hit the subscribe button below. Just back on the reshuffle, just for 1 second. I had one. It wasn't a sort of major choice. I didn't want to discuss a very long piece by Gordon Brown. No, don't switch off. It's a really interesting piece by Gordon Brown in the New Statesman, and we have mentioned the New Statesman, I think, in all of the last 3 episodes. So I'm
I
not
hope they're
going
sponsoring us.
I'm not going to labour the point. However, so much has happened in politics in the last 10 days, 2 weeks in the UK, that I just thought there was the Brown piece, intentionally or unintentionally, illustrates the scale of the problem that faces Labour and just the dominance of Boris Johnson at the moment. See how long that lasts. Some people are predicting 10 years, but politics tends not to work out like that. But Gordon Brown has written a piece based on some really interesting polling, essentially, that he's done in his latest Save the Union incarnation. And the headline is "The Britain of Emma Raducanu shows why nationalists are losing the argument." So I'm just going to read the intro. It says, "A new Britain is waiting to be born. It is economically progressive, egalitarian on race, religion, sex and gender, culturally centrist on law and order, defence and our history and traditions. It has a far stronger sense of place, not only keen to celebrate our local as well as national identities, but insistent that local communities be empowered with the control and the resources to make levelling up a reality." Now, what he's describing, he's describing, he might not see it this way, but he's describing the Conservative Party, as you said, Maggie, and that is a paragraph that could have been written by Boris Johnson.
Absolutely.
And it illustrates, I just think, how...
Come. How... It's all jargon. What does it mean? Yes, it is the Conservative Party, but it's empowerment, all that sort of stuff. What? It's like a soundbite generator. Put stuff, random things. I'm sorry, I don't find it interesting or insightful. I know it's not, but to you, Iain. But I've heard Gordon Brown say that 100 times before.
I do find it interesting because I think it's one of the first examples I've seen of a big Labour figure, a grandee, actually attempting to grapple, whether you like the phrasing or not, with the realities of life after Brexit and the shifts there have been away from globalisation. I mean, this is, remember, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, for when they dominated in the way that Boris now appears to dominate politics for now, when they dominated, their speeches were all about the inevitability of globalization, the way in which forces of technology, trade were going to mean that the nation state would still exist, but would sort of fade into the background, that this was going to be a hyper globalized world. This change couldn't be stopped. So Britain either had to adapt to this and go with it, or be left behind in the great global race. So I think that was David Cameron's version of it. And of course, 2016 is a rejection of that. It's an attempt to rebalance, say, actually, no, that elite view of globalization is wrong. Globalization comes with all sorts of downsides as well as upsides. So let's have a course correction back towards nation, place, all the rest of it. Now he is phrased in Gordon Brown terms, but that's him admitting, recognizing, Maggie, tell me whether you agree or disagree, those new realities.
I haven't read the whole piece, Iain, but
well done, Maggie. I couldn't get to the end of it.
I'm not sure if I will after this, but no, of course I have a glance. Yeah, I sort of agree a bit with both of you, actually, but
oh, come off the fence, Jews.
It is easy to come up.
I'm going to be cut off, I think, in a minute. I'm a bit rowdy today.
I mean, if we want to get to the depths, what the pandemic and Brexit has shown us is the fragility of globalization. And, you know, not just the fragility, but the supply chain infrastructure, our own country, and of course, all the higher wages that we're seeing coming through, which was one of the big Brexit arguments. And it's very hard for the Labour Party now to argue against some of these higher wages. So I think they've got themselves in a bit of a pickle. It's an interesting.
There's a good column on all of that in the Times yesterday. I forget the guy who wrote it, but.
Can't think.
But it was one of the arguments. Thank you for mentioning that, Tim. But it is.
It was a good piece. If Gordon Brown was a bad representative of Scotland in his piece, I don't know why you're sucking up to him. I'm going to suck up to you, and yours was a really good piece. And political obsessives like me were fascinated by the reshuffle. But I bet the average reader, this whole thing about rising wages for people who actually need their wages to rise, you wrote a much more relevant piece.
But I think in his way, Gordon Brown is essentially saying, you know, there's no way back for the centre-left in Britain, in England particularly, unless it recognises, you know, voters are inherently patriotic and they quite like the country. They might think that certain things need to be fixed in it. The country has all sorts of problems, but inherently they like it. It was really interesting, though, writing that piece about, and I wrote for the Times about what seems to be happening in the labour market and pressure on wages and labour shortages. And the numbers are up in the air because of the pandemic. But it's just really illuminating to be challenged by some people who were ultra-Remainers at the time, who said, look, this freedom of movement, actually, I mean, do you remember it was said it really makes no difference to wages. It's not really a downward pressure on the low paid. Okay, fine. Well, I sort of contest that, but the numbers are contested, and there's an argument to have. But then now say, look, Brexit and the end of freedom of movement means labour shortages, and there seems to be in certain sectors like drivers and food processing, wage inflation. Well, which is it? And I think there's a really, I think, a cross-party conversation to have, which is that essentially Thatcherite labour market reforms, which I'm broadly in favour of, combined with EU free movement, created a business model in this country for 30, 40 years that is inherently dysfunctional. And people are worried about labour shortages. Certain companies, certain parts of big business just have to rethink. Some of that will be more investment in machinery, and some of it is paying the low paid more. Anyway, on that note, I think we're going to wrap up for the week, Maggie, but I think you had one more thing you wanted to mention, which is related to your choice from our last episode on Norway, and now we know what happened. You want to highlight a really interesting piece on what it means.
Yeah, absolutely. I just thought, as I mentioned it last week, I'll tell you the result, if you haven't seen it, which is that the Labour Party did get the biggest party, so it can lead a coalition. But it still was the lowest vote, second lowest vote that it's had since the 1920s. So whilst a lot of people have been saying this is a sort of shift to social democracy, social left back in Norway, it's not quite true. But there are 9 parties, and the Arbeiderpartiet Party has to form a coalition with either with the Centre Party and the Socialist Left. Now, both those parties are inherently Eurosceptic, which is slightly different from here in the UK, because Norway, of course, is not part of the EU, but it is part of the economic, the European Economic Agreement. Have I got that right? Yeah.
EEA, yeah.
EEA, the EEA. and of course EFTA. Now, both these Eurosceptic parties have said that part of their condition for joining in coalition will be that they renegotiate with Brussels. They don't like all the power and they don't like the extent of the budget. But the Labour Party has said, no, absolutely not. They're very pro being part of the EEA. So it's going to be interesting to watch how those negotiations go.
We know what Michel Barnier thinks about.
Well, yes. We need to talk about him, actually, don't we? We really do.
In a future episode, I'm sure. Well, the French election, there's going to be lots of opportunities to talk about that. I would just say, Maggie, to our Norwegian friends, if they are going to, after the experience as that Britain's had in negotiating with Brussels, if Norway's about to have a renegotiation with Brussels, all I can say is good luck.
Good luck, absolutely.
But Theresa May is available, though, if you want her help.
I think it's a lot of hot air, personally. I don't think they will.
Yeah.
But I think he'll probably have to pretend, the Prime Minister-to-be will pretend that he will try and tackle some of the inequalities.
Yeah. I think everyone in Europe has learnt that after the British experience, that negotiating with Brussels is not necessarily straightforward. But on that note, we're going to wrap up this episode of Press Review. I'm Iain Martin. I was joined by Tim Montgomerie and Maggie Pagano from the Reaction team. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, hit the subscribe button below. Please like this video and also go to the site where you can get all of the journalism produced by the team. You also, if you become a member of Reaction, you get my weekly newsletter every Saturday morning, which is on politics, geopolitics, economics, culture, and all manner of other stuff. But until next time,
I'd just like to make a promise to our viewers. Please visit next week. I'm going to do everything to stop Iain Martin recommending another Gordon Brown article next week. It will be a safe space for you. Don't give up on us.
I'm being nice about Gordon Brown, but then
Save the union. It's very important.
I promise. It's the union. He's doing good work on saving the union, and I promise not to tell my stories. I promise not to tell my stories, Tim.
In this mess.
I promised. That's a different argument for a different episode, but I promise not to tell my stories about having to edit Gordon Brown's incredibly long pieces, which he used to.
Now I would be interested in that. That's really
fun.
We'll save that for another episode. But you've been watching Press Review. Thank you very much for joining us.
I'm in rebellious mood.